Nice of you to join us, Michael. We're really glad to have you with us. As a way of prefacing things and get into the discussion, why don't you tell us a little bit how long you've been studying Semitic languages and when you first stumbled over some of Sitchin's work, Michael?
Well, I've been studying Semitic languages since the late 80s. That's when I started graduate school. And, it's a considerable distance between then and when I first heard of Sitchin. I first heard of Sitchin around 2001. And I was, at the time, at the University of Wisconsin working on my dissertation. And I decided to take the first year of what should have been my dissertation and write a novel. I sort of just needed a break from graduate school, so I wrote The Facade. And The Facade doesn't actually have anything necessarily to do excuse me, with ancient astronauts, but once I wrote it and people started to hear about it, I started to get asked about Zecharia Sitchin. So I went back and did some research as to who this fellow was. And at first I thought, I had found sort of a kindred spirit, somebody who had an ancient language background, who was interested in UFOs and things like that, because that's really what The Facade was about. The UFO question. But the more I looked, the more I discovered that, boy, this guy really doesn't know a whole lot about ancient languages at all, and I began to wonder what he was doing. And basically, I think he's sort of like an Eric von Daniken kind of figure, although I think the difference between Sitchin and von Daniken is that Sitchin, whether he's trying to cultivate it or not, I think a lot of it is really due to his followers. But he's sort of passed off as an ancient language expert who's into this topic. And as I said a few moments ago, I don't think he's that at all. But I do think he really believes what he's saying. I don't think he's sort of playing a game with people. I think he's really committed to it. But I think his work isn't going to impress anyone who is actually in these fields. And it was kind of a disappointment, but I found eventually that he had a huge following, and so I've sort of become this villain figure for people who follow Zecharia Sitchin. And that's okay, because I think I should just be honest with people and tell them, point out what the problems are, and hopefully they'll decide on the basis of evidence, not on emotion.
Right, exactly. And that's a good point, I guess, to bring up as well, that we're obviously not interested in sitting here bashing anybody. This is about just looking at the material that is presented so people can make up their own minds, just as you say, Michael. And, there's a lot of people that have mentioned that he is one of these people who is the only one in the world who are able to read cuneiform. That's one of these myths, I guess, that have been going around for a long time. And maybe back in the 70s and 80s, when people didn't know anything about this stuff, that might have worked to say that, so to speak. I don't know if he says that anymore publicly. I have no idea about that. But obviously there's tons of people in the world who are reading cuneiform at this point, right? And a lot of studies are going into it, right?
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, you probably have, I think it would be fair to say there are probably less than 200 people who you could really say are experts in Sumerian. You have many more that have a certain level of expertise in Akkadian. And they're two different languages. They use the same script. The Akkadians adopted the cuneiform script from the Sumerians, but they're actually distinct languages that aren't actually related linguistically. But yeah, it is certainly not the case, to claim that Sitchin is either at the forefront of this, so he's not, or that he's the only one who can do this sort of thing. It's just hard to believe anybody would say that, but I've heard a lot of things to this point that I guess I can't really doubt it.
What is, if we ease into it here, so to speak, what is some of the problems that you have with some of the material that Sitchin has presented? I heard you once, you mentioned that this is not about as much as about interpretation of the material as it is about the actual fabrication of material. Can you tell us about that?
Sure, and that is true. I mean, there are some things where you could look at what Sitchin's doing and saying, well, that's kind of an odd interpretation, and nobody else is really going to look at it that way. But the issue is interpretation. But there are a lot of things that the issue just goes beyond that, to Sitchin staking out positions and making claims, saying that the Sumerian tablets say this or that, when it's just not there. It just doesn't exist in any tablet. I'll give a few examples here. For instance, there are a lot of references to the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki were an important subgroup of gods in the Sumerian pantheon. But it's a complete fabrication to say that there are texts that describe the Anunnaki coming from a place called Nibiru, and having Nibiru being a planet beyond Pluto that circulates through our solar system every 3,600 years. I mean, there isn't a single text, a single line of any text that says that. And I go on, different shows and say that, and say, look, it would be easy to make me go away. All you need to do is produce one text. Just produce a line of a text that connects these ideas the way Sitchin does. And if that were the case, it would be very easy to produce that, but it's not. And on my website, sitchiniswrong.com, if people go there and they click on the Anunnaki tab on the left, one of the things I'm trying to do is to get people to primary text materials so that they don't have to take my word for it, but that they can check up on me, and in the process check up on Sitchin. So on that page, I have a video of myself. It's not very exciting, but I think it's effective. It's a video of myself searching something called the Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature. This is a website. It's run through the University of Oxford. It's online. It has hundreds, 400 or 500 texts in Sumerian, both in Sumerian transliteration and in English, online. It's free. Anyone can access if they read how to do it. And the video shows me typing in the Sumerian term for Anunnaki into this text corpus and searching for the term. There's over 100 of them that show up, and then showing people that, look, if you click over here, you can get the translation of every one of these texts where Anunnaki shows up in the Sumerian material. And just read through them. You will not find a single text that has the Anunnaki associated with Nibiru in any way, much less it being a planet or a spaceship or anything like that. So that's just one example. I try to show people, look, you don't have to take my word for it. Just go look yourself. The whole idea of Nibiru, again, cycling through 3,600 years. Well, we know what Nibiru is because we have the textual material. It's all been translated. And I have another video on my website of me going again online. These are free resources, looking up the term Nibiru in something called the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, which is a multi-volume work. It's over 20 volumes of really anything that's related to Akkadian and all the other sort of cuneiform dialects, where you can look up terms. It's just a massive dictionary and read through the entries, and it lists out. It took 40 years to produce this set, and the reason is because they try to list out the occurrences of each word and tell you which tablet it's in. Well, you read through the entry on Nibiru, and you find out what it is. I actually have a summary of it on my website under a tab called Nibiru, where we know what Nibiru is. It actually shows up in Mesopotamian astronomical texts every year, because Nibiru was a certain sky phenomenon. I personally think it has something to do with a constellation. It's not a planet. It's not. It doesn't behave that way. Although Nibiru itself could be a planet. It just marks a crossing in the sky of something. So in some texts, it's a star that shows up annually every year. In other texts, it's identified with Jupiter. Again, it probably has something to do with a particular observation of Jupiter, maybe in conjunction with some constellation or something. In another text, it's identified with Mercury. Well, it can't be all these three things at the same time, so it has to mark some event. It's a star that has something to do with some event or some sky astronomical phenomenon. But you're never going to find a text that has it cycling through our solar system every 3,600 years. In fact, if you look at Mesopotamian astronomy, and again, these texts are all published, you can find them all in translation. The Sumerians did not know of a planet beyond Saturn. Well, I would think if they knew that there were 12 planets, like Sitchin says, that their own astronomy, their own astronomical texts would say so, but they don't. So those are three examples of things that I say he's just making it up. It's not about interpretation. It's about whether these statements in the text actually exist, and I'm saying that they don't.
And in these search engines, obviously, you type in, everything is translated, so you just type in these words in English. Is that how it goes?
You can do it either way. The best way to do it is to type in the Sumerian transliteration, and in the video for the Anunnaki, I show you how to type that. So what I want people to do when they watch that video is, stop it, go to the website, and just type in what I type in, and then they'll get their own list of hits. For Anunnaki, the other word for Anunnaki is the Anuna, and then they can it might take them an hour or so, but they could just literally go through every occurrence of the term and read it, and see if Mike is telling the truth or if Sitchin is telling the truth. And since I'm the one inviting you to do it, I have a pretty high degree of confidence, what you're going to find.
So tell us a little bit about the archive that is being searched. You said it took a long time to compile this, and is this a compilation then of all the known texts out there that have been found and dug up and discovered, or what is contained in there?
This is a compilation that includes any text that Zecharia Sitchin will reference in his documents, or in his books, because Sitchin isn't doing any personal translation. He's using English translations. All the texts, all the epics, the Sumerian epic cosmological literature, they've been known for over 100 years, and so all of those are present in this archive. I don't know that every tablet is there, although if you actually go to the website, the language used on the website makes it pretty much sound like they've got everything except maybe boring economic records or something like that, receipts. And there's a lot of that stuff, because that's why written language was really invented, was sort of a tabulation system. And there are whole books that aren't terribly exciting again on Sumerian that people can go out and read as far as to explain how the language evolved. But it was a system to track who has what and who owes what to who, and distribution of economic goods and that sort of thing. So barring some of that, yeah, it includes all the epic literature, all the stories that you would be interested in terms of how the Sumerians believed that they got there, and their relationship with their gods and all that sort of thing.
Absolutely, and I do want to talk a little bit later about what their mythology do say then, if what is contained within it, what some of the stories are, and we can talk a little bit more about that later on. But I guess one classic that always comes up is a specific cylinder seal, as it's called. This is the VA243. This is, I guess, one of probably the most known image that we're shown when we hear something in terms of Sitchin, the Anunnaki, and Nibiru, and so forth. And you've done obviously a breakdown, so to speak, of this cylinder seal as well, where there's of the language and many of these symbols are contained within this. But maybe you can tell about this, and why do you think that this is the primary one, I'd reckon, as well, then, that comes up all the time in terms of Sitchin's work, right?
Right. The biggest argument against this cylinder seal indicating 12 planets are the Mesopotamian astronomical texts themselves. And again, people can find a bibliography on that on my site, or they can go up to something as simple as Wikipedia and put in Mesopotamian astronomy, and the bibliographies will all be there too. If the Sumerians and the Akkadians and the Babylonians after them, if they don't have any record, any notation, any side comment, nothing, if they don't have anything about 12 planets in their astronomical texts, I mean, where else are you going to find it? I mean, this was their business. This is what they did. This is why they made these texts. So if they don't know of 12 planets, we're not going to get 12 planets from a picture, a cylinder seal, but of course that's what Zecharia Sitchin says it represents. Well, we don't. There's text material on this seal. It has nothing to do with astronomy. It says nothing about the image, the little dots there with the star thing in the middle. So the text itself on the seal doesn't support Zecharia Sitchin's reading in any way. Again, I have a translation of it on my website. But the other thing is the central pictograph that Zecharia Sitchin refers to as the sun, because he has to have that as the sun, and then the dots around it are the planets, and you add up all of them collectively, and you get 12, the sun and moon being referred to as a planet in his reconstruction. That is not the typical Sumerian representation for the sun. I have a number of examples, again, on my website where the sun is depicted as a globe with wavy lines. And what you actually see on the seal is very typical for a star itself. And frankly, the dots are very typical as far as smaller stars as well. For instance, the Pleiades in other texts is depicted as just 7 dots. So I think what's referred to there is probably some sort of constellation, and probably has something to do with the agrarian cycle, because that's what the seal is about. The god is presenting a hoe, again, an agricultural instrument to these individuals. So it's going to have something to do with, again, the gods making all this, agricultural cycle work and that sort of thing. They get credit for the fertility of the land and the crops and all that sort of thing. Mm. So something as esoteric as what Sitchin is saying, you would at least think that in the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lines of Mesopotamian astronomical records, that you would get some indication of 12 planets, or, again, anything beyond Saturn, but you don't. And so I would ask Zecharia Sitchin, well, can you explain that? Can you explain why your interpretation of this picture is in direct contradiction to Sumerian and Mesopotamian astronomers? Mm. I think that's a really impossible question for him to answer.
Right.
I'm sure he'd make something up, but you're not going to get a coherent answer to that.
One of the things in the seal, of course, that the people also might look at, and which has been detailed, is about the third person in the picture there, or the god, whatever that actually represents, Dub-Si-Ga. You have on your website a person name of a powerful person in that way, and obviously what people can see, if you stand this character up, he'll be much taller than the other two who stands before him. And do you think that could be a hint in terms of that this is a god, or is this a symbolic way of showing that this is a powerful person? What do you think that represents?
I think that the seated being is a deity figure. It's sort of a classic pose. It would across the board, really you can make a very broad generalization here and be in the ballpark, but deities, when they're pictured in the ancient world, the ancient Mediterranean anyway, are often pictured as being bigger than humans. And that's because, if I can use sort of a childish way to express this, gods are bigger than people.
Sure.
They're more powerful. They're smarter. They're beyond human existence. And so this was one of the way that ancient people sort of brought that idea across, just in terms of size. Obviously, you think about the reverse effect. If you were depicting your deities as these tiny, puny little sorts of individuals, and humans just look bigger and more powerful, it would really be a mixed message. It would really be incongruent to the mind. And so that artistically, that's just a stock way of describing deities. You'll see it in Syria, Palestine. You'll see it in Egypt. It's because they're gods. The deity figure gets gets a little amplification in size to distinguish them. You have very few references. It's kind of a curious thing. You know, people bring up the Genesis 6 story, for instance,
Sure.
about the Nephilim and whatnot. You don't really get much in Mesopotamian material about kings, you know, the offspring of the gods being taller. There are one or two where that is said, and those individuals do actually use that as an argument for their right to rule, their right to be king. They're because they're taller than everybody else, and the claim is that, you know, that has something to do with the gods, you know, fathering them and all that sort of thing. So you do get it, but it's very unusual. It's very uncommon in the text. But again, the great size is sort of one of those primitive pre-scientific markers. You know, if we thought the same way today, everybody in the NBA would be in charge. We're a little bit beyond this, but the idea is we can still appreciate it.
Right. So, I mean, what do you think then in terms of the whole Planet X movement here that have arisen on the web as a consequent? I say it's a combination of things, and obviously the Sitchin story feeds into this and gives credence to the story, obviously. But then we have things out there happening. NASA obviously looking for what they call a nemesis or a brown dwarf star as a possible explanation for some of the weird effects that are happening to our sun, that it might have a companion and things like this then. But overall, is there anything you can say, or how do you see that this field has developed from your point of view, Michael?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, there are a number of indications that astronomers have known for a long time that there's, you know, something out there beyond Pluto, whether that is something we would call a planet, because, you know, we're sort of stripping the planet status from Pluto. So whether we can call it a planet, whether it would be something habitable, whether it's just, you know, some other feature, you know, part of an asteroid belt or something like that that's beyond there, that's what they're working on. But that has nothing to do with affirming, you know, what Sitchin is saying. It would be really interesting. It would be really great. In fact, it would be kind of amazing for Mesopotamian astronomers to have, you know, known something like that and to have written about it. But as I mentioned a few minutes ago, you know, we have hundreds of lines of their material, and they're full, complete treatises on astronomical observation. And again, they're depending on naked eye observation, so that's what would make it so fantastic. It's also the reason why they never mention it. I mean, they don't know anything like this. And so what you have here is you have only Zecharia Sitchin's spin or interpretation, and I would say, in this case, outright fabrication of these ideas. And so to marry those ideas to what astronomers are trying to do today is quite a foolish thing. I think it's quite a fruitless thing as well. But that's not to you know, to denigrate the effort. I mean, if something's out there, then that's what astronomers do, and hopefully they'll find something that explains whatever it is they're trying to explain, and the discipline will move on, and we'll learn more, and so on and so forth. But there's quite a disconnect between what Sitchin is trying to say. You know, he has every right to say it. What he doesn't have a right to do, in my mind, is to say, hey, it's in these tablets. Because nobody, I mean, who's going to check? First of all, scholars would look at Zecharia Sitchin and consider him a waste of time, because he's not in the guild, so part of that is scholarly mentality, which is an unfortunate thing in my view. You know, he's not a Sumerian specialist. He doesn't publish in any journals. He doesn't do anything at academic events. Nobody knows who this guy is, except for what they hear on the internet, and they look at what he's put out and what people are saying about him, and they honestly think he's a quack. You know, and I think that's probably the wrong attitude to have. I would think that here, if you have a guy that has, you know, a tremendous influence over a lot of people through his popular books, you know, that ought to draw attention. And one of the reasons that I decided to get involved at this level is to say, look, you know, that he has every right to publish this, but it's just not reality. It doesn't correspond to reality. And for you to base your worldview on something like this that has no basis in the primary texts is just really an unwise thing to do.
So obviously, at that point, then, if you come to this realization and you agree with what you say here, Michael, then obviously the question is, well, what is the agenda of that then? Is it just to make up a funny story and maybe sell a few books, or is it a deeper agenda behind this thing? There's speculation, obviously, again going on around the web that this is a plot, a conspiracy, if you will, in that sense, to actually feed into the whole alien scenario, and that we've been visited, or even that we have other creator gods out there as well. What do you think about that, Michael?
Well, I do. I mean, I'm a theist and I'm a Christian, so I do believe, that there is an unseen world. I don't think that's an unscientific thing to say, because plenty of scientists that I know believe that as well. Plenty of philosophers, of course, plenty of theologians and biblical scholars. So I'm in that arena. So I do believe that there's an unseen world. I believe there's intelligent evil. And I say that to say this. I don't think Zecharia Sitchin needs to have a sinister mindset for ideas that I think are destructive in terms of a theistic worldview, a traditional theistic worldview. I don't think that needs to be laid at the feet of Zecharia Sitchin. I don't know if that's where he's at. I've heard all sorts of weird things about Sitchin from talk show hosts off the air. Anything from, again, he's part of a big conspiracy, he's getting paid by this or that group. I've had people tell me he's a reptilian alien in disguise. I think that Sitchin really believes this. I think he's a journalist by training. I don't see any evidence that he knows much of anything about ancient languages. He's Jewish, so I'm guessing he speaks Hebrew, but that doesn't really mean he understands the grammar. I mean, how many of us, I always use this illustration here. I mean, everybody here that I'm talking to speaks English, but how many of us could diagram sentences and do, linguistic analysis of it?
Right.
It's just two entirely different things. And when you're an ancient text geek, when that's your business, you have to be able to do that. And I don't see any evidence that Sitchin can do that. I think that he sort of saw some things. He's sort of like his followers, that he sees a certain set of ideas and he begins to imagine different possibilities. And I think it's really ruled by imagination in his case, really wanting to believe this alternative history rather than something evil and sinister and whatnot. I think, intelligent evil can use these kinds of ideas, but I don't think that necessarily has to be laid at the feet of Sitchin. I know there will be people who are just firmly there, as you mentioned, that they have a real high level of distrust for what Sitchin's doing, and they may be right, but I'd approach that like anything else. I'd like to see some actual evidence for that this is all just a complete scam, for sinister reasons. I think he's made a lot of money off of it, and he really believes it. He's committed to it. But again, my take is that if you want me to come over to this side, you got to start answering some of these questions. And you can't just be making things up, saying that they're in text when I know that they're not. And I'm trying to get people to look at the primary text material. All you got to do to make Mike go away is just produce the texts. Then I'll say, hey, I was wrong. It's actually in there. And maybe at that point we can argue about interpretation, or I can say, well, there's something to this. This now becomes a competing worldview or something like that. But short of actually having it be in the material, that's not going to happen as far as I'm concerned.
I guess just a short note on this, another aspect of, if you will, then a proof that feeds into this whole idea that there is a conspiracy out there to spread information about aliens being in charge of human creation and further on from that, there's a number of other objectives, of course, that could be kind of achieved if you want to look at it that way. But I've heard that he has his office in Rockefeller Plaza as one thing, as a kind of an evidence that, okay, the Rockefeller family are behind him in some way. Have you heard that as well, Michael?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I have heard that, and I've had, again, people that how can I describe them? You know, people that would be well known in terms of speaking and lecturing and radio, that are sort of on this paranormal circuit, if you want to call it that. People that your audience would instantly know, that have told me that, and really just out and out say, you know, I do not trust this guy, do not trust him. And these are people committed to an alien worldview. And that's the part that really surprised me when I had those conversations, because you would think that, boy, you know, these ought to be two peas in a pod. They ought to be on the same page. And there are several. Again, they would have instant name recognition, but they've asked me not, you know, to talk about them.
Sure.
But I've had a couple of them. I'm sure there are other people who would align themselves completely with Sitchin, but I've had a couple of them just say, this just really stinks to me, and the Rockefeller thing is part of that, you know. And again, it was surprising to me, but I'd like more than the Rockefeller name.
Yeah,
I know the Rockefellers are deeply embedded in movements toward global governance and sort of elitist, progressive, you know, fascistic, you know, political, you know, things like that. So I know a decent amount about them, but whether to say that Sitchin is truly bought and paid for and is knowingly and willingly spreading a lot of BS, you know, just to sort of further an alternative religion, really. That might be the case, but I'd like, you know, something more than that before I come down and say things like that about him.
What do you make of the what is known as the Rockefeller Initiative? Then there's talk, obviously, about official disclosure in terms of the UFO ET question as well, and Hillary Clinton has been involved in this. There's photos, but you know, her walking with Lawrence Rockefeller.
Yeah,
and other things like that as well. How do you view that from your point of view? Do you see that, yeah, it could be actually the case that there is an agenda there? Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that aspect of it isn't true, but it sure would be interesting if all these things are combined, and we're faced with a situation where a lot of the evidence that they're bringing forward here is faulty, so to speak. If I put it this way, the Sitchin material might be something that is culturally is being laid as the groundwork that, yeah, look at this, even in ancient past of human civilization, this has been evident that we've been visited, etc. What do you think, Michael?
Well, I think that's possible. That would make Sitchin either a pawn in this, or again an active participant. I think he is at least a pawn. I think others will take his material and try to argue these cases. Again, because so much of it is just not there, it would be a difficult argument. But I think that the whole point of this is the idea. I actually think that's part of, if we want to talk about efforts to create an alternative worldview and an alternative global religion, or just a serious competitor that would be completely naturalistic. That would appeal, you know, to the atheist, to the Eastern religion person, to the person coming from Western religious perspectives, traditional Judeo-Christian perspectives, Islam, all the way across the board. This would be a centerpiece to that, and what I mean by that is, I do see that this whole thing could be intelligently used to create an alternative to theism, and by definition, an alternative to the ideas that spring from theism, like Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And what I mean there is, if you sort of, everybody gets to win if this is your religion, because the person who doesn't believe in any of these religious books, or doesn't even believe in God, if all of a sudden some authority figure, somebody at NASA or whatever, would say, hey, look, we have evidence that there are intelligent extraterrestrials and they actually came here, and then use that as sort of the launching point to say, well, probably a lot of the religious texts that we see produced in the ancient world were really about these visitations. That idea, to a person who's an atheistic naturalist materialist, would say, okay, I get it. I could see where these ideas about God come from, and they're real. They were really caused by something that actually happened, and I'm not offended if there's a greater intelligence that itself is the product of naturalistic evolution. If that's out there, and if that kick-started life here, and if that could be credited with an evolutionary jump on our own part, that's completely palatable. Now, right now, that's crazy talk, because again, no authority figure, not the scientific mentality. They need an authority figure to come out and say that. But if they did, and if NASA came across as being very serious there, well, that appeals to the person who otherwise would be an atheist, and they still would be, because you're not talking about a God separate from creation like the Bible or the Quran talks about, or any of these other book religions. Well, the people with the book religions, Islam already has a place for extraterrestrial intelligent beings out there. They could marry that to what they believe. I think a lot of them would refuse to do that, but they could conceivably. The same thing with Christianity. You get to keep your Bible. It's literally true. It's just that you have to sort of look at it from a different angle. Yahweh is real. He's a real entity. He just happened to come from someplace outside the solar system or some other planet, and Jesus is the alien hybrid and all this stuff. All of that transitions from crazy talk to, oh, well, I see how that could work if, again, some authority figure came forth in the scientific community that everyone would respect their opinion. And it would have to be more than one person. It'd have to be an institutional sort of move. If they came forth and did that, then you don't really need to be Sitchin to be right in all of his details. He was in the ballpark, and then he can be recast as a visionary and all this kind of stuff. But you get what he's saying and what others are saying, really extending from the idea. So to me, the idea is important. It's bigger than any one individual or any one set of books. And so I do think that it would be a useful thing. And part of this is sort of sequel turf to my sequel to my novel, The Facade. I'm actually going to lay this out, how I think this would work. But it's actually can be a very comprehensive sort of alternative worldview that on a number of levels would make sense to anybody, regardless of who they are, and everybody could go away feeling like they were right, feeling like their religious texts are real, and they weren't just gibberish and all that sort of thing. And so I do think that the idea could be quite useful to completely altering, again, traditional worldviews, and propping up something in its place that would be, a displacement of traditional religious beliefs. The thing that troubles me about that is, at the same time, and here's why I think it would appeal to globalist elitists. Okay, if we want to, use terms like that. Along with that idea comes the idea that the gods did select certain individuals, certain human lines, bloodlines, to rule. And that's what the globalist elitist thinks of themselves. And once you have that idea out there, you bring this second idea along and you massage it however you want. At that point, you can almost say anything, and people's eyes are going to glaze over and say, "Oh, well, I guess you're right. I guess you have science behind you for these claims, and you are more capable, more skilled. Maybe you're even superior in physical, biological, intellectual ways." it'd be very easy for someone to sort of twist that idea, come up with the second idea, and justify global governance. And I think that would be the interest if these people like the Rockefeller family are actually thinking, or actually using, or thinking about using this particular religious idea, the Sitchin's ideas, as part of a justification for global governance. It wouldn't be hard for them to do.
That's right.
If I can imagine it, they can imagine it. I mean, again, we don't know that that's the case, but it would be actually a pretty easy thing to do.
Right. And the question there, of course, on top of that is, okay, so why are they doing that? Are these people set out to because they actually want to try to create some kind of peace in the world? Does it come from a genuine, like, we have to solve some of these religious problems that we have in the world, and it's up to us to pull those strings, and even if that means fabrication of materials that are produced and interpretation of that, then that's the necessary step to do. Do you think that could be the case as well? That it might not be? Yeah, go ahead.
That's the marketing.
Right.
That's pure marketing. Everywhere that this sort of mentality, this globalist, elitist, or divine right to rule idea has been carried out in human history, it's led to vast human misery and death and fascism and dictatorship.
Yep.
You can dress it up however you want, but it is an assertion of superiority of one class to the subjugation of everyone else. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. And frankly, if it got to that point, you can whip out the Mesopotamians there too and say, well, the gods created, the human kingship, to hold humanity in check. Again, this idea that humanity was created as a slave race, and the rulership is more than human because it's a divine human sort of situation where the rulership can be said to be the offspring of the gods. They're special. Again, everywhere that this has been tried, it has led to told and untold human misery. And so all of that global peace and this or that, we can solve X, Y, Z problem, it's just marketing. It's a justification for humans on a very large scale surrendering their liberties, surrendering their dignity as individuals, and the power to govern themselves over to a small group of people, under the assumption that they just know what they're doing and they have our best interest in mind. Well, history, frankly, says otherwise.
Couldn't agree more on that point. So what do you make in terms of the ET talk that is beginning to come up now in the mainstream? I mean, it's always been there in the undercurrents, so to speak. Larry King, among others, have been covering some of these things for a pretty long time now. Stephen Hawking is coming out. We mentioned this many times on this program before. We have the Catholic Church or the Vatican talking about ET being born with what they term them without original sin, and that they are brothers pretty much out there in space. Do you see that as a sign of easing this into the religious world as well, and easing it into the mainstream, or what's your take on that?
Well, I think a lot of that is sort of I'll give it the benefit of the doubt. I think a lot of it is in the part of the religious community, like the Catholic Church, their attempt to, well, if this turns out to be real, how are we going to parse it? I mean, we have to have some sort of coherent response and coherent answer. So I think giving them the benefit of the doubt, it's their sort of best shot at being prepared for some eventuality. You can look at it more negatively, that they're trying to sort of steer a mindset or steer an understanding in a certain direction. And again, you probably have people in in both those camps. But it's actually a very, very old question. The question of other worlds goes all the way back to Aristotle, and you'll find it discussed in early church fathers and people like Aquinas, and all the way up through to modern times. And the church's general perspective, and I say church here in the widest way possible, up until, well, it was sort of a negative assessment of it until you get into the Middle Ages. But in the Middle Ages, the dominant position became that there are other worlds, and those worlds could be populated, because to deny that would be denying God's omnipotence, his ability to do so. It became something called the principle of plenitude, that we have to give God his due, that he could, and if he could, he probably would do all these sorts of things. And so it became, the church became very open to the idea of other worlds. And that lasted until Darwin. After Darwin, after the idea of evolution was tied to a lot of this by the scientific community, within the Protestant world anyway, it really fell out of favor. I think it's sort of making a comeback now, because across the board with different Christian bodies anyway, you have more of an acceptance of at least the idea that evolution is at work somewhere, somehow, in the fabric of creation. You have theistic evolution, or you have progressive creationism, or any number of these labels. And so it's not something that's viewed today as an issue that would upset the apple cart. Now the discussion has really moved to, well, if we have one, what about the image of God? And what about some of these other doctrinal issues, like the existence of the soul, the need of salvation? What about the atonement, and all this sort of thing? So it's gone into more of these other areas of theology. But I just think it's an old question. I don't think it's necessarily driven today by anything that's being sort of put out there by Zecharia Sitchin or the UFO phenomenon necessarily. People have different motivations for entertaining the thought, trying to reconcile their religion, whatever it is, with this question. I think a lot of the talk is generated by mathematics, to be completely honest with you, that this whole idea put forth by the Drake equation, which I think is basically nonsense.
Yeah.
In terms of the Drake equation itself, that the math is in favor of life, being out there on in some other worlds. Well, on my blog, UFO Religions, I posted something about the Drake equation, but people can just look it up on Wikipedia. You'll find out that every component of the Drake equation is nothing more than a guess. And so it's an equation based upon a series of guesses that produces a guess. I mean, there's nothing empirical about it, but yet people tout it like it's just some great watershed sort of discovery that mathematics, the hard sciences now are on our side as far as life being out there. No, it's a guess. That's all it is. And the components of the Drake equation are made up on the basis of data that doesn't actually exist. They're guesses. They're just postulates. They're hypotheses strung together and into an equation. And out pops this idea that, the odds are so dramatically in favor of life existing elsewhere. It's just not the case. But people like to talk about that. It's sort of factored into popular culture and in movies and whatnot. And I think that's what really feeds a lot of the discussion. But again, what people are doing with the discussion, what people are doing with the ideas, is an altogether different subject.
Yeah.
And that's actually where my interest focuses on. How are people processing the idea, and what might be done with the idea is actually more interesting to me.
Well, maybe we can get into that a little bit later here, Michael, as we proceed into our next segment here, I'd like to take a short little break here. And the thing you mentioned there obviously is good to keep in mind. And a lot of that we do right now is based on estimates. We run computer models, and we think we know what actually is going on in reality. But as it were, we are still waiting for a lot of these, the evidence of these claims, of course, to come to the surface. And these things are good to keep in mind. But Michael, why don't we talk just a few minutes here about your websites? Of course, you have quite a lot of things going on online, as it were, Memra and IPPS. You have online universities pretty much in terms of people who are interested in studying languages and things like this, right? Why don't you tell us about this and give us some of the websites that you have out there as well, Michael?
Sure. Yeah, both of these are sort of, they're an experiment in that I've been asked to do something like this many times. I've been actually teaching biblical studies online in distance ed for well over 10 years. And so, you know, for MEMRA, that's an Institute for Ancient and Biblical Studies, I have a lot of material that, you know, I could present, you know, online to students in a low pressure, really no pressure, you know, kind of environment, and we can really get into a lot of these topics. And so I thought, well, why don't we try that? And so this is the first year for it. In terms of the catalog, there are over 60 courses that people can take. Most of them are 6 weeks long, and it's in an online environment. I'm using something called Moodle that's used very widely all over the world in distance ed. And so students would do a combination of readings. I'll be linking to podcasts. I'll be doing, you know, audio interaction with students, maybe video casting, other different video selections, 6 or 7 different sort of what I'm calling weekly activities that are guided by me and by a syllabus. We'll enter into discussion boards. I'll be, you know, participating on them to interact with the material that they're either reading or watching or listening to sort of, you know, try to create a classroom atmosphere, even though it's a disembodied situation. But a lot of the things that I would normally do and have normally done, teaching in the college classroom now, can be accomplished online. So that's the idea behind MEMRA and behind the Paranormal Institute. But MEMRA, people can take courses in, there's a sequence in biblical theology, there's of course traditional Old and New Testament courses. I'm offering courses in ancient languages. Those are typically a year long, because what I do is I go through a grammar and I screencast and capture on video me going through a grammar and explaining, you know, if it's Hebrew or Greek, you know, what the grammar is talking about. I go through all the exercises with students. You know, after they've attempted to do so for a week, I'll go back and do the exercises and walk students through, you know, to learn the language and so on and so forth. But it's a long-term commitment on my part, and of course on the students' part as well. There are courses in ancient religions, ancient history. I have a sequence on the Book of Enoch so that we get into some other ancient texts. And for the Paranormal Institute, it's basically the same format, but the areas are different. I have Professor Judd Burton, who just finished his PhD in historical anthropology, University of Texas. He's doing this with me. Judd is offering a whole sequence on things like demonology and giant lore, vampire lore, history of the occult, that sort of thing, religion and mythology. And for my contribution is basically a history of UFOs in the United States, alien abduction narratives, the whole ET and religion question, ancient astronauts. So those are the courses that I have for that institute, that I teach and that Judd teaches. So this is, again, something of an experiment. I want to see how many people are actually interested in this. We're going to try to get at least 4 or 5 people enrolled in each class. It starts in October, so there's a lot of time for people to register. Registration goes up to September 19th. for each institute, and then we will get started. I'm actually doing something like this, and have been doing it for the last year, and teaching Hebrew and Greek online. So that sort of contributed to well, why don't we do things that aren't languages and see if there's an interest in this? And so the idea for these institutes was sort of born out of that as well.
All right, that's excellent. And then, of course, what we can mention is if you go to michaelsheiser.com, from that website you can click through to some of these sites here that we're talking about, and you have a lot of blogs, of course, as well up there, and various things surrounding these topics that you mentioned here, Michael. And then, of course, we need to mention also the Facade, of course, your book again. Then they could find more information about this at facadethebook.com. Isn't that right, Michael? They can pick up a copy if they so want from that website. Is that right?
Right. And they can. There's a link on the main site too. I also have a redirect for listeners. Instead of michaelsheiser.com, if they type in DRMSH, that's DR as in doctor, and then my initials MSH.com, that'll redirect them to the main page, because a lot of people don't know how to spell my really due to his followers. But he's sort of passed off as an ancient language expert who's into this topic, and as I said a few moments ago, I don't think he's that at all, but I do think he really believes what he's saying. I don't think he's sort of playing a game with people. I think he's really committed to it, but I think his work isn't going to impress anyone who is actually in these fields, and it was kind of a disappointment, but I found eventually that he had a huge following. And so I've sort of become this villain figure for people who follow Zecharia Sitchin, and that's okay, because I think I should just be honest with people and tell them, point out what the problems are, and hopefully they'll decide on the basis of evidence, not on emotion.
Right, exactly, and that's a good point, I guess, to bring up as well, that we're obviously not interested in sitting here bashing anybody. This is about just looking at the material that is presented, so people can make up their own minds, just as you say, Michael. And there's a lot of people that have mentioned that he is one of these people who is the only one in the world who are able to read cuneiform. That's one of these myths, I guess, that have been going around for a long time. And maybe back in the 70s and 80s, when people didn't know anything about this stuff, that might have worked to say that, so to speak. I don't know if he says that anymore publicly. I have no idea about that, but obviously there's tons of people in the world who are reading cuneiform at this point, right? And a lot of studies are going into it, right?
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, you probably have, I think it would be fair to say there are probably less than 200 people who you could really say are experts in Sumerian. You have many more that have a certain level of expertise in Akkadian. And they're two different languages. They use the same script. The Akkadians adopted the cuneiform script from the Sumerians, but they're actually distinct languages that aren't actually related linguistically. But yeah, it is certainly not the case, to claim that Sitchin is either at the forefront of this, so he's not, or that he's the only one who can do this sort of thing. It's just hard to believe anybody would say that, but I've heard a lot of things to this point that I guess I can't really doubt it.
What is, if we ease into it here, so to speak, what is some of the problems that you have with some of the material that Sitchin has presented? I heard you once, you mentioned that this is not about as much as about interpretation of the material as it is about the actual fabrication of material. Can you tell us about that?
Sure, and that is true. I mean, there are some things where you could look at what Sitchin's doing and saying, well, that's kind of an odd interpretation, and nobody else is really going to look at it that way. But the issue is interpretation. But there are a lot of things that the issue just goes beyond that, to Sitchin staking out positions and making claims, saying that the Sumerian tablets say this or that, when it's just not there. It just doesn't exist in any tablet. I'll give a few examples here. for instance, there are a lot of references to the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki were an important subgroup of gods in the Sumerian pantheon. But it's a complete fabrication to say that the single text that has the Anunnaki associated with Nibiru in any way, much less it being a planet or a spaceship or anything like that. So that's just one example. I try to show people, look, you don't have to take my word for it. Just go look yourself. The whole idea of Nibiru, again, cycling through 3,600 years, well, we know what Nibiru is because we have the textual material. It's all been translated. And I have another video on my website of me going again online. These are free resources, looking up the term Nibiru in something called the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, which is a multi-volume work. It's over 20 volumes of really anything that's related to Akkadian and all the other sort of cuneiform dialects, where you can look up terms. It's just a massive dictionary and read through the entries, and it lists out. It took 40 years to produce this set, and the reason is because they try to list out the occurrences of each word and tell you which tablet it's in. Well, you read through the entry on Nibiru, and you find out what it is. I actually have a summary of it on my website under a tab called Nibiru, where we know what Nibiru is. It actually shows up in Mesopotamian astronomical texts every year, because Nibiru was a certain sky phenomenon. I personally think it has something to do with a constellation. It's not a planet. It's not. It doesn't behave that way. Although Nibiru itself could be a planet. It just marks a crossing in the sky of something. So in some texts it's a star that shows up annually every year. In other texts it's identified.
Nice of you to join us, Michael. We're really glad to have you with us. As a way of prefacing things and get into the discussion, why don't you tell us a little bit how long you've been studying Semitic languages and when you first stumbled over some of Sitchin's work, Michael?
Well, I've been studying Semitic languages since the late 80s. That's when I started graduate school. And, it's a considerable distance between then and when I first heard of Sitchin. I first heard of Sitchin around 2001. And I was, at the time, at the University of Wisconsin working on my dissertation. And I decided to take the first year of what should have been my dissertation and write a novel. I sort of just needed a break from graduate school, so I wrote The Facade. And The Facade doesn't actually have anything necessarily to do excuse me, with ancient astronauts, but once I wrote it and people started to hear about it, I started to get asked about Zecharia Sitchin. So I went back and did some research as to who this fellow was. And at first I thought, I had found sort of a kindred spirit, somebody who had an ancient language background, who was interested in UFOs and things like that, because that's really what The Facade was about, the UFO question. But the more I looked, the more I discovered that, boy, this guy really doesn't know a whole lot about ancient languages at all, and I began to wonder what he was doing. And basically, I think he's sort of like an Eric von Daniken kind of figure, although I think the difference between Sitchin and von Daniken is that Sitchin, whether he's trying to cultivate it or not, I think a lot of it is there are texts that describe the Anunnaki coming from a place called Nibiru, and having Nibiru being a planet beyond Pluto that circulates through our solar system every 3,600 years. I mean, there isn't a single text, a single line of any text that says that. And I go on, different shows and say that and say, look, it would be easy to make me go away. All you need to do is produce one text. Just produce a line of a text that connects these ideas the way Sitchin does. And if that were the case, it would be very easy to produce that, but it's not. And on my website, sitchiniswrong.com, if people go there and they click on the Anunnaki tab on the left, one of the things I'm trying to do is to get people two primary text materials so that they don't have to take my word for it, but that they can check up on me and in the process check up on Sitchin. So on that page, I have a video of myself. It's not very exciting, but I think it's effective. It's a video of myself searching something called the Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature. This is a website. It's run through the University of Oxford. It's online. It has hundreds, 400 or 500 texts in Sumerian, both in Sumerian transliteration and in English, online. It's free. Anyone can access if they read how to do it. And the video shows me typing in the Sumerian term for Anunnaki into this text corpus and searching for the term. There's over 100 of them that show up, and then showing people that, look, if you click over here, you can get the translation of every one of these texts where Anunnaki shows up in the Sumerian material. And just read through them. You will not find a single